Good evening, sharps and squares, degenerates and casual bettors. I'm the Wizard of Odds, Christopher Smith, and this is the SEC Country Gambling Show presented by MyBookie. We're live every Thursday night from Atlanta, Georgia, and on this show we have one purpose and one purpose only, and that's to win you some cold, hard cash. All right, I'm here as I am every week with Steve the Sheriff. Steve Petrella, the Sheriff. How are you doing today, Sheriff?
I'm fantastic. I'm gonna keep
taking more of my money?
This is mine. Yeah, this is mine. I haven't been paid all year for this.
Well, all right. Well, that's enough of the money talk. Let's get right into my power rankings after the SEC Championship game. And as you can see, Georgia needs to be number one because they beat Auburn.
They did.
And they're 12-1.
Yep.
And they won the SEC Championship game. I still have Auburn at number 2 because they beat Alabama in the Iron Bowl. Everything else pretty much stays the same from there. As you can see, there are 9 SEC teams that are going to bowl games as we turn to the second half of my power rankings. And Ole Miss at 6-6 is on probation. They will not be eligible to make a bowl game next year as well. And they have some players that are transferring away from that team. And Arkansas, Florida, and Tennessee, 3 of the 4 teams at the bottom of this list, have brand new head coaches. Jeremy Pruitt just hired away from Alabama at Tennessee recently this week. Vanderbilt, that means Derek Mason and Mark Stoops at Kentucky they're 2 of the longest tenured coaches in the SEC now, and they're kind of on the hot seat probably for next year now. So let's go ahead and get into the bowl lines for the SEC. Coming up a week from Saturday is the first game. What is it, December 16th here in Atlanta?
Celebration Bowl, baby.
Bowl kicks off bowl season. The SEC does not start until December 27th with Missouri and Texas in the Texas Bowl. And as you can see here, there's a ton of SEC games and big bowl games this year. Missouri, that's the only game that will have take place before our next show, which will be December 28th. And we'll go through all the rest of the SEC bowl games and picks during that time. But I just wanted to get you guys a sense of the market already. As you can see, the national semifinals, the SEC is favorites in both of those games. Georgia and Alabama are favorites there. Auburn is also a favorite, 9.5 points against Central Florida, the team that no longer has Scott Frost as their head coach. Beyond that, you can see 5 different SEC teams are playing on New Year's Day this year. No bowl games on New Year's Eve this year. I believe that's on a Sunday. So no games. NFL's probably during that day. No college games during that day. And there are 4 underdogs in the SEC. South Carolina, Kentucky, and Mississippi State are all a touchdown or bigger underdogs. Texas A&M is a 3-point underdog. Several of these teams are playing in their bowl game without the coach that took them through the regular season. So we'll get into our bowl picks in our next show, which again is December 28th. Ahead of those huge SEC bowl games. But since the season just ended, I figured we'd go through the biggest winners and losers from the SEC from a betting perspective during the 2017 season. And Steve, what do you think the biggest winner in the SEC was this year?
It's got to be Georgia, right?
What do you know? They won the SEC?
They won the SEC, and in the first graphic you have the number against the spread, and Alabama goes 11-1, but is only 10 points better than the number. But Georgia, who most people thought they were still a year or 2 away from really being nationally relevant, best the spread by 107 points. And that just shows the disparity between what odds makers and the public perception was and what they actually did on the field compared to a team like Alabama.
He had 9-4 against the spread. That's a very healthy number.
Yeah.
If you bet $100 on every game, you made somewhere in, not quite $1,000, but you made several $100s.
Yep.
There weren't very many teams in the SEC this year that made you legitimate money. Georgia, just a great team. Not only were they a good team, but they were a great team. They won a lot of football games, and they won a lot in gambling. And so, I don't know if you like Oklahoma or what, but something to consider early. Oklahoma opened as a favorite in that the Rose Bowl against Georgia. Georgia's now a 1.5 point favorite. Georgia's been great against the number all year, so you didn't get the value if you're waiting to bet this game till later, but it's still very hard to go against Georgia at this point as well as they did this season.
Yeah.
There's really only one other team that we can classify as a good team from a betting perspective in the SEC this year. Any guesses?
South Carolina.
You're right. South Carolina.
South Carolina.
And another thing about them going into their bowl game, they started the season 7-2-1 from a gambling perspective.
It's a great team.
They lost their last 2 games. And not only did they lose to Wofford, Clemson annihilated them.
Yeah.
And part of that's because South Carolina at the line of scrimmage is not a great Power 5 team right now. Their offensive line is no good. Their defensive line is not far, in front of that. And so you're looking at them initially against Michigan. We know Michigan's got a great front seven. You're looking at, is their offensive line good enough to beat South Carolina's defensive line? I think it is. That's the reason South Carolina's a 7.5-point underdog there. But throughout the season, if you bet on South Carolina, very good. But I think this is an instance that the market has sort of corrected itself at this point. We do have plenty of teams in the SEC that were bad gambling teams, unless you bet against them all year.
Right.
Which team do you think was the very worst?
It's got to be Florida.
Close.
No?
But there was Florida is on the list. Arkansas is not even on the list.
What?
They were so bad.
How many bad?
There's a lot of bad teams in the SEC.
An abysmal year.
There's one team that did not win a single SEC game all year. Some people thought they would win 8-9 games, and that's Tennessee. Yeah. Tennessee is officially the worst team in the SEC from a betting perspective for the 2017 season. They were 3-9 against the spread this year.
That's terrible.
And they lost to the number in total, even including the 3 wins. They're minus 104.5 against the Vegas line. So as good as Georgia was good, Tennessee was equally bad. Obviously, they just hired Jeremy Pruitt as their new head coach. Butch Jones, unfortunately, for bettors that like to bet against him, has been shot into the sun. He's gone. But Tennessee was a terrible team. If you're a Vols fan and you bet on them all year, you are more optimistic than anybody that I know. Mm-hmm. And also, you lost a lot of money.
Yeah.
So the second worst team is actually Kentucky this year. Kentucky was 3-9 as well against the spread, although they only lost in total minus 52 against that number.
Yeah.
So another bad team. They actually were 5-1 to start the year off, and then 6-2 at one point, and then they finished 7-5. They're fortunate that they won a lot of close non-conference games, and they played in the SEC East.
Yeah.
Otherwise, that's not a bowl team. It's one of the reasons you got to think Mark Stoops may be in trouble if Tennessee and Florida can get their act together. Kentucky is almost an automatic 0-3 in those games, and then Louisville. Every year they got to play them. Lamar Jackson's not going to be there next year, but that's still a decent program. So if you're Kentucky, then you pretty much have to win out the rest of the games to improve from where you are this year.
Yeah.
I don't think that's going to happen.
Is this a team, we can look at and say, hey, they won so many close games. They were 3-9 against the spread. That those 7 wins probably weren't as authentic as some teams, and maybe you can look to fade them next year, bet they're under win total depending on what it is.
It's possible. They have the problem with Kentucky is they've won a lot of close games for 3 years in a row now. Mm-hmm. And so that's part of the reason they went 3-9 against the spread this year is because they won a lot of close games in 2016, and so they were a little overvalued entering the season. I'm wondering if the markets may adjust and put Kentucky where they should be entering next season, but it's certainly worth looking out for to see how they position Kentucky in the markets next year. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned Arkansas. Arkansas was 4-8 against the spread. There was one team in the SEC still that was worse than 4-8. There was 3 teams worse than 4-8.
Vanderbilt?
And Vanderbilt actually won enough games against the spread.
Yeah.
Florida. There's just so many bad teams in the SEC from a gambling perspective this year. I hope you weren't like just pro SEC all year and bet at SEC teams everywhere. Florida was 3-8 against the spread, and they didn't play Northern Colorado because of the hurricane, or else they could have gone 3-9 as well.
The Bears are covering that game.
And that's 3-8, even though they beat UAB against the number late in the season.
Yeah.
So, Florida, new coach there as well. We'll see how Dan Mullen does. He exceeded expectations a lot at Mississippi State. New year, new team for Florida next year. They don't play in a bowl game, unfortunately, so this information doesn't do much for us. But Tennessee, Kentucky, and Florida, all 3 on our bad teams this year in the SEC from a gambling perspective, all in the SEC East. You got to think the dark ages of the SEC East are coming to an end at some point.
Yeah. And we didn't talk about this before the show, but I'm curious to kind of put you on the spot here. Are there any teams, like I know you liked Auburn a lot coming into this season, are there any teams that you're looking at for 2018 to say, hey, this is a team that's going to make a pretty significant jump either up or down? Is there kind of a, not necessarily a dark horse to win the conference, but a team you think is going to be in a position where Georgia is 9-4 against the spread plus whatever against the number?
I think you got to look right back at Tennessee and Florida. I mean, they both have new coaches. They both are recruiting top 15 classes every single year. Mm-hmm. I know there's some questions about Dan Mullen's recruiting and Jeremy Pruitt as a first-time head coach at the FBS level. But, you know, the SEC still includes Kentucky, Vanderbilt, Missouri, and South Carolina.
Right.
And, you know, the non-conference schedules for those teams isn't going to be awful. So, I mean, I don't expect either of those teams to do what Georgia did this year and make the playoff next year. But I think they could very easily win 8-9 games. And if people are skeptical about them after the season, then there could be some value, at least early in the season, for those two teams. And then you got to look at Mississippi State. You know, you got Nick Fitzgerald coming off of a major injury. His foot was backward during the Egg Bowl. And they've overperformed almost every single year. They lose Dan Mullen, who was there for 9 years. They have an 8-game bowl streak. Now they have a coordinator from Penn State who I believe is also a first-time head coach.
He's the coach at Fordham.
First time in the, in the FBS
coach, yeah.
So if there's a team that maybe could step backward, it could be Mississippi State. I mean, A&M now has Jimbo Fisher. Ed Orgeron's been better than we thought at LSU. Alabama and Auburn are still going to be really good.
Yeah.
And with the East getting better, you know, it's not going to get any easier for Mississippi State.
Right, sure.
Now, speaking of looking at win totals and how teams are, let's take a look at the SEC win totals for the 2017 season. This is what Vegas and MyBookie thought that these teams were going to win before the season compared to what they actually did. South Carolina was the biggest overperformer in the SEC. That win total was 5.5 before the season. They won 8 games before they played Clemson to end the season.
Yeah.
So they crushed that mark early. The upset against NC State in Week 1 certainly helped that. But Will Muschamp has proved to be a very strong coach in his second run in the SEC. And then, of course, Georgia, Mississippi State, and Auburn all outperformed what they're supposed to do. And in the middle, a lot of teams, you know, Missouri is interesting because they started out terrible against the spread and then roared back and destroyed things at the end of the year. They finished the season on a 6-game winning streak to... In the last game, a close win over Arkansas, they got over the number of 6.5. Now going to the back half of the SEC, we see some teams that were very poor this year. You can see Florida minus 4.5 against the win total. I haven't seen a team that did that in a long time in the SEC. Granted, they had 1 game canceled against Northern Colorado due to bad weather, so it's really minus 3.5. You assume they would have won that game. Yep. But Tennessee, Arkansas, and Florida, once again, terrible teams this year. Kentucky's slightly better when you look at their record as opposed to their record against the spread, as we talked about earlier. Vanderbilt, once again, not making a bowl game after they did last season. So those are the teams this year. I don't know if your team did well, didn't do well. We got bowl season coming up.
Yeah.
Good news is a lot of new coaches in the SEC, a lot of new opportunities next season. There's going to be SEC Media Days right here in Atlanta before we know it. So if your team underperformed this year or overperformed, you might not get the same thing next season.
Yeah. It's never too early to start preparing to bet next season because you want to have that edge in September. You want to find a handful of teams that you can say, I'm going to bet these teams in the first 2-3 weeks because I think they're undervalued in the market. And then as the market starts to correct itself, you'll be way ahead of the 8 ball and have a nice bankroll on mybookie.ag, hopefully.
That's right. And if you've been betting with us all season, you know we've made you a lot of money. But if you haven't, you can always go to mybookie.ag today before SEC's bowl games and the other bowl games and NFL playoffs and NBA and college basketball. And you can use the promo code SEC Wizard. And mybookie.ag will graciously, thanks to their partnership with us, will match your deposit up to 100%. So a nice little boost for the holidays. Yep. You got some leftover money from your grandma or a gift card or whatever that you can sell to your friends.
Some cryptocurrency.
To make, been on a big run with Bitcoin, you can sell it and bank on some more money with MyBookie. But yeah, we'll be back again on December 28th to go over our SEC bowl picks. Until then, I hope you don't be too aggressive on the early bowl games. They're tough to predict a lot of times. You don't want to blow your bankroll in those games. But for the Sheriff Steve Petrella, I'm the Wizard of Odds, Christopher Smith. I reminded you that good teams win and great teams cover. I hope you have a very Merry Christmas and a Happy Hanukkah and any other holiday that you may celebrate. What's the one from Seinfeld?
Festivus.
Festivus. Happy Festivus as well. And we will talk to you again on December 28th. And until then, good luck with your bets, and we'll see you then.